Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to the second lecture for our Spring 2022 MA Aesthetics and Politics lecture series. My name is Amanda Beach, and I'm the Dean of the School of Critical Studies and also faculty on the MA Aesthetics and Politics programme, where this series is a part of our curriculum. And first, I'd really like to thank everyone for being here, our speakers and you, especially the audience, as well as our valued people in technical support, Rosa and Moham, who have been helping us to produce this series. I hope you'll find the talks thought-provoking enough that some of you will add your questions to the live web stream chat as we go, which you'll just find to the right of your screen. And the format for this series is 3 sets of talks, each featuring one main speaker and a respondent. And our final session in the series is held on April the 7th at the same start time as this. And there we'll be welcoming Tony Bogues from Brown University, and James Trafford as his respondent. But today I've got great pleasure in welcoming Gean Moreno and Jaleh Mansoor as his respondent. Gean will present first, followed by Jaleh's response, and then we'll have quite a bit of time, I hope, to open this out to the audience for a larger discussion and clarifications and questions. And as some of you know who are used to this series, each semester we explore a different topic. And this spring, we've been discussing the theme Dominance and Revolution, which has the very complex subtitle, The Image, the Struggle, and the Use of Force. So just to go over this very briefly, we're looking at how themes of dominance and revolution are not so popular today. The idea of a comprehensive reorientation of our world is claimed to be impossible, and the notion that there is a visible concentration of power that might be called dominant has been eviscerated by both neoliberal global capital as much as in the disaggregating mechanics of critical theory, which have preferred to speak about horizontal forms of power as opposed to some of the verticalities that we witness in our everyday lives. In such case, the question of our social and political future has been described as open, but also we can see that that in itself is limited. Accordingly, on the one hand, we are told that there are no grounds, no givens, and no truth, which seems to hold the promise of open possibilities. But on the other hand, these possibilities struggle to be free from the conventions and habits that not only define the condition of capitalism, but also constrain us to its ontology. So in this series, we've been exploring the possibility of theorizing, thinking, and picturing the relations of the past, the present, and the future, but to do so in a constructive sense. In our last session, Katerina Kolosova discussed the possibilities of the structure of the catharsis in the mode of the theatrical, where a form of tragedy that takes place repudiates a dialectic of human emotions as its center that can easily be unified as a holistic form. Instead, tragedy is seen as an assemblage of a clash of structures in time and space. Such an assemblage is resistant, for it articulates the irreducibility of alienation to philosophy itself, where philosophy is read as the pathology of an idealism that obfuscates the foreclosure of the real. But it is also constructive, since Kolosova asks us to redescribe the paradigms of human production with another metaphysics, a view that affiliates itself with the alienated, automated, and structural elements of the human as animal condition, to see another story at work in what, if often solely taken as the history of our self-narration. Alice, Lucy, Rickhab responded to this with a poetics of their own that extended these questions to an alien anthropology that included the degraded, pixelated haze of cultic practices, alien autopsies, and the working of primordial materials. So both presentations, I thought, asked us to consider if it's possible to take account of the complex form of science that we need to speak to today. That is a science that knows that it cannot claim the hubris of objectivity, but at the same time that it must also understand that to sacrifice itself to humility by declaring itself as a form of subjective mythology is equally an invention and is equally false and ridden with its own problematics. So today we'll continue to ask about dominance and revolution, We will open up questions such as what it is to know these terms as ideas and material conditions, and to ask, what is the relation between the emancipation that revolutions imagine and the dominance that their consequences might entail? Do revolutions in the name of emancipation produce dominance because, ironically, the revolution was not managed well enough? And if freedom should or can be legislated, structured or managed, then what does this mean for our understanding of it? So there's obviously a lot of complex questions going on in this debate. And to just speak to some of them today, we have our pleasure, in welcoming Gean Moreno, who is director of the Knight Foundation Art and Research Center at the ICA in Miami in the USA. Moreno has organized exhibitions dedicated to the work of Helio Otissia, Terry Adkins, Larry Bell, Ettore Sotsas, and others. Moreno is also co-director of NAME Publications and the Migrant Archives Initiative. He has contributed text to various catalogs and publications, including eFlux Journal, Kaleidoscope, and Art in America. He was on the advisory board of the 2017 Whitney Biennial and the 2018 Creative Times Summit. He edited recently Real Abstraction and Contemporary Art, an anthology that Verso released in 2019. And his talk today will be called The Last Revolutionaries, Artists in Times of Rectification. His respondent is Dr. Jaleh Mansoor, Associate Professor in the Department of Art, Visual Art and Theory at UBC, Canada. Jaleh Mansoor is a historian of modern and contemporary cultural production, specializing in 20th century European art, Marxism, Marxist feminism, and critical theory. Mansoor's research on abstract painting in the context of the Miracolo Italiano and the international relations of the Marshall Plan era, nested within the global dynamics of the Cold War, opens up on the problems concerning the labor to capital relationship and its ramifications in culture and aesthetics. Her work includes the book Marshall Plan Modernism, Italian Post-War Abstraction, and the Beginnings of Automania, which is Duke University Press in 2016, and monographic studies on the work of Piero Manzoni, Ed Richet, Agnes Martin, Blinky Palermo, Gerhard Richter, and Mona Hatoum. She is currently working on a new book, tentatively entitled Concrete Abstraction, the Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Labor, on the entwinement of labor value and bare life in the work of Santiago Sierra and Claire Fontaine, among other contemporary practices that examine the limits of the human. So thank you both for joining us today. Thank you again to our audience and for our tech support. And now I'm going to hand over to Gean for his talk. So welcome, Gean. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda, for the invitation. Jaleh for responding. So I think what I'm going to present today is part of an ongoing research project around Cuban artists between 1986 and 1990. Yeah, I'm going to share my screen now and we can get started. Great. So I think that one of the arguments that undergirds all this is the idea that forms kind of freeze their times. That forms are socially determinate. This doesn't mean that that's all they do, but it's certainly quite significant. And it's not all they do, because I think they also freeze the possibilities of those times as well, right? The possibilities of exiting those times. So I think since that's where I'm starting from, I think a very schematic, quick economic history of the Cuban Revolution would be a good place to start. What I'm going to present is not kind of controversial amongst kind of social historians and economic historians. They kind of break up the revolution into these stages. The controversy for them is whether these are based on pragmatic state policy or real ideological investment, but that's a whole other battle that it's going to be far another field. So just quickly, so the revolution triumphs in 1959, and it comes into power with kind of a humanist, nationalist, statist, but not Marxist discourse. And the first thing it does is expropriate land through agrarian reform and collectivize the means of production. This kind of materially manifests as a 50% drop in electricity, a 50% drop in rents, a minimum wage and a minimum pension. So the goal is here a kind of egalitarian distribution of wealth across all sectors of society. 1961 comes around. We have the Bay of Pigs invasion, which is when the Cuban exiles who left to the United States during the first 2 years of the revolution tried to invade and topple the revolution. So what this created was a tightening of all the structures, a centralization of planning, a reach out to the USSR. And this is the first time that the revolution names itself as Marxist-Leninist. This again is a continuation of collectivizing all the means of production. And it's also the first time where state agencies come together to organize all parts of the economy. One of the things that the revolutionaries wanted to do was diversify the productive base. They thought that because sugar was the main crop and the main economic element, and it had been since the Spaniards arrived, it was imperative that they just diversify and not be dependent on that, since sugar, of course, is dependent on a very volatile market. It's a commodity that goes up and down all the time. And so they wanted to diversify. What happens though throughout the 1960s is that sugar itself becomes the one commodity that Cuba has to trade. And in particular, it trades it with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union pays way above market price for it. So this is how they stabilize the economy. While there's a desire to diversify, real world conditions don't allow it. So sugar will continue to be the main crop. And this will be important as we move on. So 1964, 1966 becomes a time of testing different models. So there's two basic camps. One is a pragmatic camp, and they're kind of thinking all the market structures that were eradicated, all the kind of centralization, all that should be tempered. And we should kind of figure out new pragmatic methods to maintain kind of a market structure in some way, so the economy doesn't stifle. And so the other side, which is the hardcore ideologues, which are led by Che Guevara, are of the exact opposite opinion. They want to centralize even more. They want to control all the economic aspects of the island, and their goal is the full eradication of the market and the law of supply and demand. So these two, for 2 years, there's a back and forth. There's a debate. I mean, it's registered in kind of economic journals and scholarly journals, and in contrasting policies. And so ironically, when Che Guevara kind of ceases to be an important figure in the revolution as a policymaker, and he goes off to fight in Africa and later in Bolivia, where he dies, the Guevarist model gets radicalized and implemented. So between 1965 and 1970, there's a full collectivization of the means of production of agriculture. There's the end of retail. There's the end of real estate market. Everything is centralized, and the government, the state, has full control over the economy. This is very fast, but this is kind of what we're looking at. This is all includes agrarian reform. Big land holdings are broken up into smaller farms and later into co-ops. And so we think, we're kind of talking about art. So what's happening culturally is this is a moment of not very significant cultural production locally. It's a moment of institution building. So literacy campaigns, an institution called Casa de las Americas, which becomes a very, very important outlet for literary production in Latin America. I mean, what we call today the Latin American boom, with Garcia Marquez and all those guys all went through there. So basically what happens locally for Cuban artists is that they have to figure out how to line up with the revolution. So what we have here is Raul Martinez in 1959 doing this very gestural kind of painting. And when we have him a few years later doing this very pop bound to the revolution with the icons of the revolution. So it's not I don't find it to be a very kind of fertile moment for local production. What is very fertile is things like cinema. So the institution called the ICAIC, which is the Institute for Cinematographic Arts, gets founded. So all what we call third cinema now, a lot of it was produced there or came through there or had support. And on the right, we have Felix Beltran, who's part of this Cuban poster renaissance. And although some of the most famous of these are kind of bound to movies and cultural events, his are quite social. So this is for a campaign to save electricity. He will be kind of who will produce the graphics for the social policies of the revolution at this time. Photography, of course, is also where this cultural production is like very fertile at this moment. You know, this picture, of course, becomes the picture we all know. And it'll be important later too for something else, as we'll see. And it is also a time of a lot of international support. So this is the last extant mural by Oscar Njorn. He did it in 1968 in the building of the Archive of the Revolution. And like this, there's countless murals, paintings that were left behind, projects. So this is the 1960s. Economically, a time of a lot of experimentation, culturally, a time of a lot of solidarity, but not, and collective projects and infrastructure building, institutional building, but not, to my estimation, very profound personal artistic production. So, so I was saying the sugar remains an important element, and what happens with the period from 1965 to 1970, the Guevara's period, is that it increasingly wants sugar to serve as its as the keel, as what keeps the ship up. So they keep selling to Soviet Union. In 1970, the revolution announces that they will do a 10 million ton sugar harvest. This is a little bit unimaginable. I mean, regular harvest was about 5 to 7 million tons. So the resources and the labor power that needed to be mobilized for this were without precedent. And in the end, the 10 million ton was not arrived at. They produced a record 8.5 million, but so many resources have been dedicated to this that every other sector of the productive economy was a bit in shambles. So this leads to an about face, a first kind of round of self-criticism and mea culpas from the revolution's leaders. And the kind of slogan for the 1960s was that the revolution was a leap to communism. You know, we were gonna, the argument the Cubans made was that if you develop consciousness, if you build what they call the new man, the productive base would follow. So the kind of objective metrics that you would need to create a communist structure were unnecessary when you can create a revolutionary subject, right? The revolutionary subject would drag the material conditions to where they needed to be. So, and that's how we get to the debacle of the 10 million ton sugar harvest. So there's a need for retreat. So in the 1971, it literally a policy is instated that it's called the retreat to socialism, and it begins with an acknowledgement of the error of trying to leap over a socialist transitional economic phase. And so this is when the Cubans will really reach out to the Soviets and begin to model their own revolution in relation to that. I'll say a little bit more about this later. So culturally, it became a moment of, I think, infertility. Not much is happening. This kind of hyperrealism came to be in place. There's a period between 1971 and 1975 that is known as the 5 gray years. And this was kind of the first purge of intellectuals. And so everyone towed the line for this period. So this happens until about 1981, a new generation emerges. And there's this kind of, at this point, mythical exhibition called Volumen Uno, in which all that hyperrealism went away, and a series of artists who were interested in the Afro-Caribbean cultures, the Amerindian cultures, who almost had an anthropological bent, came into the scene. And of course, this was a way for revolutionary institutions, cultural institutions, to come up to date. This coincides with the kind of first steerings of postmodernist discourse and discourse of the other, and all this. So it's a way for the revolution its institutions to be up to date, but not to have confrontational content, right? Content that is confrontational to policy, et cetera, et cetera. So artists like Jose Bedia and Juan Francisco also emerge. So you could see, like, on the left, it's a sculptural piece very much based on the morphologies of Afro-Caribbean altars. On the right is this very kind of poor materials, heavily invested with mythological stories. This is the bird. This is based on the myth of the birds that the shamans of the Americas used to travel to each other's territories and exchange their wisdom. Both of these artists are initiates in Afro-Caribbean religions. Also was part of the Lucumí religion. Bedia was part of what is called Palo Monte. So this is what's happening as things at the institutional economic level are moving in the direction the Soviets are moving it. In culture, there's this drive away from what could have been a kind of a social realism in a kind of Chuck Close key or something. First Havana Biennial happens at this point. So again, culture itself becomes a way for the revolution to go out into the world. If it had kind of revolution in the 60s and 70s, in the 80s, it has culture. And so we get to 1986 in the process of rectification. And this is kind of what I want to talk about. And I think I'm going to read a little bit and then just come back. I'll leave you with this image. This is from a catalog from 1991 in which most of these artists are collected. And in translation, it's The Children of William Tell. If you know the story of William Tell, the child of William Tell is the one that stands by the tree as he shoots an arrow, trying to hit the apple on his head. And so the title comes from a song in which basically William Tell is being told that his children are sick of standing with the apple on their head and want the bow and the arrow now. So, coinciding with the emergence of the artists we will look at, the leaders of the Cuban Revolution inaugurated a historical sequence defined by what they called a process of rectification. It was time, they said, to acknowledge and correct the errors and negative tendencies that characterized the previous decade and a half. A decade and a half of deep Soviet influence in which the morphology of the Cuban Revolution changed radically, redefining its state apparatus, its ideological profile, and its foreign relations. The process of rectification was characterized by the eradication of a number of economic practices, including independent real estate sales and small-scale retail, for instance, in order to curtail profit-oriented tendencies that had flowered and regenerated forms of private accumulation. By the recognition that a party and bureaucratic elite had emerged and wielded new power and privilege, by the renovation of ideological tendencies that had been set to hibernate at the end of the revolution's first decade in order to allow for deeper alliances with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and at a lower but not altogether insignificant tier of collective significance by opening a space for cultural production that sought to engage in direct and critical exchange with cultural policy and the bleaching of historical data and contemporary realities. It was before a looming domestic fiscal crisis and the institution of perestroika and glasnost in the Soviet Union that the process of rectification was instituted. Cuba refused to follow along the general tendencies of the socialist world. Instead, facing new economic relations with the liberalizing USSR and its satellites, which no longer included debt payment deferrals and turned to hard currency instead, the island doubled down on its radical tendencies and returned to the discourse that characterized its earlier periods. Part of the adjustment it faced was also determined by the fall of prices of sugar and oil on a global market, shaking the island's steady income streams, as well as by the depreciation of the dollar against other currencies and its effect on both foreign debt and financing that Cuba had secured unprecedented levels of during the prior decade. All these changes were unfolding against a larger geopolitical shift that far exceeded national or even regional borders. The period of the process of rectification came at a moment during which what used to be called the Third World or the tricontinental world was restructuring itself through and for liberal experimentation, fostering the disintegration of revolutionary governments, and with the emergence of post-colonial societies looking to integrate into a world economy. The process marked the slow disappearance of the conditions that made Cuba a pertinent international actor, with the possible exceptions of its African military missions. Alongside these more immediate alterations, there were the changing structural conditions of capital accumulation on a global scale, which swept up Cuba as a trade-dependent economy. In response to geopolitical changes, both inside and beyond the socialist world, it was time, the party in Havana proposed, to go back to the original values of the revolution. It was time to remind everyone that revolutions are moral enterprises as much as political and economic ones. Discourse around solidarity and working for the greater good replaced a fixation on productivity. The spirit of voluntarism was called upon again, exemplified in the reactivation at a large scale of formations such as the microbrigadas, voluntary and unpaid workers mobilized to build housing and social facilities. Revolutionary austerity and sacrifice were the call of the day, and plunging living standards were to be endured in the name of self-determination and national dignity. Chez ideas, which had never quite aligned properly with Moscow, made a comeback. Chez's image had always been around, but his ideas and writings were nowhere to be found for a long time on the island. It was time, in other words, to return to something similar to the Guevara's system that had guided the revolution, generally since its inception, but more directly and formally on the political, economic, and ideological planes between 1965 and 1970. This was a system that prioritized subjective conditions, considering that advances in consciousness could drive advances in the productive phase. So I think the question that haunts this moment is, with rectification, does the revolution return as its own aftermath? On the side of some limit that encloses its vital moment? Does it return as a future that can only live mimicking its past, enacting a kind of teleology paradoxically jammed on a repeat cycle? Does it return from a structural point of view as a farce, as a process that is no longer adequate to a changed geopolitical context? It is not an imaginative response to, since the very conditions of production and accumulation have themselves changed on a global scale. The seismic shift that would come with the collapse of the International Communist Project just a few years after the process of rectification began, and the sharp about-face it forced on Cuban economic practice makes it useless to speculate on long-term consequences. Although, of course, there are numerous pertinent books tracing the immediate effects of these policies. But what one can much more easily claim is the revolution came back, in quotes, in the mid-1980s, having revealed, despite its claims to return to its universal truth, what it revealed was its contingent character. It could become something else. It had a smelting kiln that extracted from the boiling liquid of revolutionary fervor the lumpy porridge of mirthless bureaucracy. that distilled from the projected irrepressible soaring of a new people towards emancipation and self-fulfillment, armies of great technocrats, and renewed market relations at the most granular levels of everyday life. It also revealed its contingent character in the farcical dimension and assumed that being out of step with a changed world, no longer a revolutionary force in it, but at most an anachronistic irritant. The institutionalization of the revolution during the decade and a half that preceded the institution of the process of rectification, in its quest to routinize the operations of the revolution, came with a new constitution based on the Soviet Constitution of 1936, the aggressive expansion of the Communist Party, also based on its Soviet counterpart, the professionalization of the army, including a new ranking system, again mimicking the Soviet model, the establishment of a national economic management system and increased reliance on computational analysis for long-term planning, the reorganization of grassroots and youth organizations, the reconfiguration of unions as instruments of workplace discipline rather than advocates for workers' rights, the formal entrance of the island into the Comecon, which is a Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, the economic agreement among the countries aligned in the Soviet bloc, and as well as with intensified trade with the West. It was also accompanied by a vigorous courting of foreign investment and the return to tourism, which had been completely eradicated in the early 60s, and the institution of organs of popular power in a number of ministries, including the Ministry of Culture. It also came with the end of the revolution's organic, if unorthodox and at times clumsy unfolding. It was a character and an unfolding that was characterized by an ideology that turned Marxist logic on its head, offering underdeveloped nations a path toward communist promises. Properly developed consciousness, the Cubans claim, the production of a new man, as they called him, could alter the material base. Sheer willpower could translate into accelerated development. And new people, it suggested, can leap ahead of history and generate an egalitarian society by acting out their refined desire for such a thing and against every objective metric that claims such a thing possible. Along with the institutionalization closing up to its socialist trading partners in the 1970s and 1980s, the revolution, through its public discourse and its claim to have tempered its push to communism, in quotes, with a developed productive base that marked its first decade, cutting to a more reasonable retreat to socialism, to a transitory economic stage, traded the idea of moral incentives for material ones. It had come to the abstraction of quantification in the system of quotas correlated to differential wages and bonuses, cost profit analysis, allocation of capital, investment, credit, interest, all pragmatically replace the question of need and sacrifice, where once capitalist tools to be transcended came back as proper instruments to guide productivity. The power and responsibility of the manager was shored up through wage reform. Overtime work proliferated as did its shadow companion, inefficiency. Price gouging, resource theft, corruption, bribing, and other non-socialist behavior spread. The low wattage humiliation that always permeates life subsumed under the protocols of alienated production must have coursed through everyone's nerves and dug deep into the collective substrate. The pragmatic development of the material base should be read insofar as it affected subjectivity, not in relation to some objective standard, but to the heavily propagated discursive formations that trumped the exceptional character of the revolution. Cuba had become a social deformation for its own revolutionary program, riven with reifying processes and differential distribution of power. In these conditions, it's no great speculative leap to postulate psychic fragmentation born of the impossibility of reconciling subjectivity that has assigned itself the task of moving history forward to the immediate reality of spinning in place and turning to the past. So awareness of the contingent core that allowed the radical change, radical in the sense of being able to reconfigure itself as an antinomy of its foundational character. A revolutionary process now pulled from the depths of the social unconscious marks a difference in the repetition. Ooh, I totally botched that sentence. I'll do it again. Awareness of the contingent core that allowed the radical change of a revolutionary process now pulled from the depths of the social unconscious, marks a difference in the repetition. The true character in this return to the true character of the revolution during the time of the process of rectification, one imagines must have graven in consciousness the distance between what the revolution had revealed itself to be through its concrete practices and their material effects, and the illusory picture through which it understands or fantasizes itself as a process that can change without changing, a process that has some constitutive truth at its disposal to go back to for renewal. In some way, it was the slippage between core and appearance and the need to overcome it, to really get back to something essentially revolutionary, or the impossibility of doing so, that I think explains the increasing radicalization and misbehaving as a symptomatic reaction of the artist of this period. So I think I want to look at how this farcical character of this times of the process of rectification are indexed, affect different artists. I think I'm going to focus on three and along the way open it up a little bit. But I want to start with Tomás Sazón, who you see here. So Tomás Sazón was an artist who came up through the elite institutions of the island. He was a prize student. And for graduation, as part of coming top of his class, he got 2 exhibitions, one in a regional museum and one in Havana. So in Havana, he did this show called Atarro Partido, which translates to something like To the Bitter End. And so this was a central painting in the exhibition. And it became quite controversial in that it both took the image, this kind of iconic image of Chez that the revolution itself was trying to rehabilitate and infuse with value, and not only racialized it, but placed it in, behind this kind of grotesque series of creatures copulating. I think one of the ways to think of Tomás's work is, well, it has this confrontational character. It takes the national symbols, this is the Cuban national team, and pits them, I think, at a deeper level, where we find kind of an index of the contradictions he's finding, is in the way he kind of just assumes this almost juvenile humor, this kind of popular humor. It's almost like that kind of sarcastic talk that you do under official pronouncements that you and your peers know, but no one can really say it out loud. And so you use kind of this in-group humor to do this. And I think this is this is how he's indexing his and it's really infantile. So for instance, the letters in the back, if you read them phonetically, say, "This fart smells like shit." So it's just this idea of being more popular than the popular revolution, right? Using the language of the street, of the corner, as a way to pit that against the supposed egalitarian pronouncements of the revolution. So this show will be closed within 10 hours. The Minister of Culture came and closed it. And it unleashed a wave of censored exhibitions. The next 4 years will be a series of censored exhibitions. So this exhibition stands as a kind of this turning point in which the threat of censorship and punishment was no longer effective. This is when artists started to say, "That's fine. We'll live with it," which was what never happened before. Before, it was always a very cautious way of moving in the world. The threat of censorship and losing your status was what kept everyone in line. And now we have a whole generation who are the elite, have come through the elite institutions of the revolution. They feel themselves deeply revolutionary. That's their ideology, that's their discourse. And so they find in that the freedom to be able to directly address this. So, the national symbols, he'll just make it. I mean, it's like this adolescent thing, but then also you start to think, this is a time when all the veterans are returning from Angola with all their arms amputated. So it's somewhere in this suggestive, vulgar thing that I think he's putting up against the niceties of official policy. So after he gets censored, he just gets radicalized, and instead of kind of, painting the dead martyr, now he starts painting Fidel himself. So this painting is called The Orgasm of the Bay of Pigs. So Fidel has used the Bay of Pigs as his one of his justifications for having to have repressive apparatuses as part of the regime, right? Because the island is under siege. The imperialists are coming, and the Bay of Pigs was the event that said that discourse and that justifies that discourse into the present. And so here Tomas kind of doesn't like this. And again, this is all kind of very, this is not behind closed doors, this is not hidden. They don't think, I believe that they think that of themselves as revolutionaries so deeply that they see their work as more revolutionary than a revolution that itself has become a bit farcical. So they do this in the street, they show it wherever. It's not a hidden underground thing. So another artist is Glexis Novoa. And so I think, again, in Glexis, what we see is kind of this rendering infantile of painting. It's almost as if she's saying, if this magical early moment that the times of rectification want to revive as some secret charm to take us to the future, is an infantile process, and so his production itself will be infantile. So he does these terrible paintings, terribly executed, and then he'll just write things like, this work is Cuban and that should be enough. So this kind of exceptionality that a drying up revolution thinks it still has, and tries to call back by calling up an earlier period, I think is here kind of splattered as ridiculous. This is a terrible painting over which he wrote, this work was done by an artist that was born and that lives in the revolution. So it's this kind of infantile understanding of your social agency, which I think mimics what the revolution is trying to do with their own. So I should say the quality of these images, some are like really terrible because they were shot in the 1980s in a socialist country. So this is why it looked like this. This is a massive kind of terrible painting. And then I think he drives it to the end. He'll just kind of come up with words. He'll make these terrible paintings and just come up with these words that mean nothing. It's almost like this devolving of expressive capacities. Again, this is the same thing. And then, so he will call these early paintings his romantic period. This is when he was a romantic, and now he's in the 1989, he moves to his practical period. So his practical period is when he kind of takes all the kind of pseudo-Cyrillic language and signage that the Russians left behind, the Soviets left behind, and then again drains them of any meaning. These are all kind of meaningless structures that then mimic the kind of monumentality and grandiosity of the old socialist monument. And so he also calls this his practical period because it was the period then when institutions really began to send them abroad to represent Cuba. With the earlier kind of awful work, it wasn't so much so. But when he started doing this, he kind of went global. So this is Carlos Rodriguez Cardenas. And so Carlos has a large body of work. he too was censored for his paintings, but I wanted to focus a little bit on this brick and worker as the metaphor. This is, the time of these micro brigades when volunteer work was again required. And these were very kind of fetishized units. They were the example for the people, right? You give up your Sunday to go build housing, things like this. So what Carlos would do is take the slogans of the revolution, like on the left, it says to build heaven, and then uses the trope of the brick and the building as a way to twist them back into obstacles, right? So to build heaven, in this case, would be to build a restricted, impassable space. The one on the right is called Autoconstruction. And again, it's this idea of you build your subjectivity in relation to the space. I don't know if you can see it with the windows, but it's just a little man building a little wall. And again, here's so this is a big mural. It says the way to march forward. And of course, the way to march forward is stumbling, right? So this is a revolution that, in wanting to march forward, has turned back and become a farce. And so this also unleashes a wave of performance art. So this is Carlos creating something that he called originals easy to acquire. So the series of prints, which he would just kind of put cement on and they would become originals. And this slowly becomes kind of more provocative. This was a large banner of Chez that an artist called Serrano put out. So if you see in that awful picture that's a little smoky, people start dancing on this. And this will imply the police come, the show gets closed, another show is censored. And these artists just continually get increasingly irreverent, and their entitlement to speak critically to power doesn't diminish the more they get censored and sent home. What it does instead is it actually creates a kind of amount of energy amongst themselves that they just become the supportive structure that allows them to be increasingly outrageous. So this is a group called Artakaya, and on the left you have these very, luminaries of Cuban art. You have Gerardo Mosquera, the founder of the biennial, there in the corner. You have Lupe Alvarez, is the woman who's like a very well-known scholar. And so this was a conference about the concept of art. And so this performance art group came in with their gas masks, saying they didn't want to be contaminated. So the idea of assaulting the institution becomes kind of a way to work. This is Glexis, who, the romantic and then practical period. This is when Rauschenberg comes to do his retrospective in Havana. And all the artists decided that he was just like the Spaniards arriving again to teach him how they should do their art. So they confronted him with these kind of images and whatnot, and interrupted him again, assaulting kind of the institution. They would do things like this. So this is called, this is a painting that would say something like, you could read it saying, revive the revolution. But since the word is not finished, what it actually says is revive the party. The party is in the, not the Communist Party, the party that you're having a good time in. And then it has a little tin cup where you could put your coins so they could finish the revolution. And so this was, all these were shuttered. All these kids were harassed. But the energy was such that the institutions then had to kind of recontrol it. They had to regather it. So they came up with this project called Castillo La Fuerza. So Alexis Somoza, Felix Suazo, and an artist called Alejandro Aguilera were given an old fort to bring all these unruly kids in. And of course, that was not going to work. So the first show there is called Patria o Muerte, which is the slogan of the revolution. It's like fatherland of death. You know, you don't compromise. And so on the left is, this is not an image from the show, but these are the works from the show. On the left is this kind of solemn revolutionary slogan, you know, rendered as like a ridiculous digital clock image or something. This is what Tomás Hassan does. Again, you know, the language of the social and all this, he just turns into this very adolescent kind of, and these are immense too. This is, I think, 5 meters by 3 meters. And then there's other artists who, again, Fidel, these were all exhibitions in that castle in the fort project. So this is, the ideas go further than the light, right? So it's, again, a little mockery of the whole process. And then this is finally what brings the whole historical period to an end. This was a collective called Abtv. And what they did a project called Homage to Hans Hacke, which in itself was a little bit ironic. But what they did was they found a painter who's in the poster in the back, who is very kind of celebrated. It's one of the, you know, the luminaries of the revolution, one of the old guard painters. And then they found 2 paintings that he made. One is of Fulgencio Batista, the dictator that the revolution toppled over. And the other, he did it in 1952, which was the year of the coup, when the dictatorship took over. And the other one is a painting of Fidel from 1986, both in the same style. So it's like these like this critical presentation of the lack of rigor in revolutionary processes, or something to that effect. So this gets censored, the project is over, and Cuban artists decide that they will go on strike since they can't make art, since they keep getting censored. So they do this collective performance called Young Cuban Artists Dedicate Themselves to Baseball. And it's literally a baseball game. And so when they played this baseball game, they were set in a field, and the field across the street was a game was going on, and it was all organized by state security agents. So even this kind of crowning end of the sequence couldn't be finished because the state security guys just became belligerent and got them off. So this is kind of where it ends, but what really puts a final point on it is in 1990, there was this exhibition called The Sculpted Object. And so the guy in the middle, his name is Angel Delgado. He was not invited, but he came and did like an improvised performance. What he did was he took the official newspaper and just opened it and laid it on the ground and defecated on it. So why this is the end is because he is the first artist to go to jail for this. So it's 1990, he goes to jail for 6 months. And by 1991, this entire generation is in exile. Here you can see him, the 3 guys we talked about in Miami in 1990. And that's where it ends. And then we have another generation that is in the 90s that is quite different. So yeah, so that's it. That's the presentation.
And thank you so much, Gean, for that talk. There's so much to consider there, both in terms of the complexity of these artworks, the strategies they're using, the situations the artists find themselves in, and also the kind of whole history of the complexity of the Cuban Revolution. So without saying any more about that, I'd really like to welcome Jaleh as your respondent. So thank you, Jaleh, and take it away.
Hi, Gean. Thank you so much for this presentation. I've learned enormously from it, and also from reading a little bit of the preparatory materials from which some of this is drawn. And I should preface by saying that my response to your presentation is broadcast from the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples here in so-called Vancouver at the so-called University of British Columbia in Canada. And that land acknowledgement bears to a great extent on some of my response to you. So I appreciated very much having an overview of this generation of artists who begin to mobilize a great deal of affective irreverence toward the mainline history of the revolution as it is received by the mid-1980s in Cuba. And we could say what you're beginning to elaborate is the beginning of a generation who are dismantling the iconography of the revolution from within. And this quality of irreverence is part of that. And in some of what I looked at for today, some of the artists also from this generation, specifically also, you mentioned that this is the moment where you begin to locate prefigurations of decolonial thinking and aesthetics. That in this generation of irreverence for the iconography of the historical revolution at this moment of rectification, which you have said is kind of, it's like revolution on a repeat cycle, and it has become this anachronistic irritant. I'm quoting your language. And that it's in this moment of revolution on repeat cycle where its iconography has become an anachronistic irritant, that the beginnings of decolonial thinking are just starting. These sort of incipient modes of thinking are beginning. And you mentioned that this is the moment where artists begin to summon an autochthonous Cuban culture to begin to dismantle colonial and imperial epistemologies. Okay, so that's the one strand I'm interested in. At the same time that these artists, despite their irreverence, despite the fact that they see this iconography as an anachronistic irritant, despite the fact that they're beginning to dismantle some of the cliches and stereotypes of the revolution, they are themselves still an index of this second wave of revolution. As you say elsewhere, revolution is back. It comes back. It's back in style in the mid-1980s. So I want to take these two strands. On the one hand, this cluster of artists as indexical to a return of the affects and the drives and desires of revolutionary thinking. But then on the other hand, this tendency within the tendency to begin to be irreverent and to dismantle, to deconstruct, to begin to undo epistemologies that the revolution is also part of. And so this brings me to the question that Amanda opened today's event with, which is that, revolution is not such a popular notion at this particular moment that we find ourselves in. And part of that is that it is understood through a variety of post-colonial and decolonial frameworks as being itself a form of imperial domination, that, those who have a kind of fetish or nostalgia for revolutionary histories are partaking in a dominant Western Hegelian kind of episteme that is anathema to the forms of autochthonous decolonial thinking that are just beginning at this moment. So I find the way that these two strands converge in your handling of the artists of Cuba of this generation utterly fascinating. And I think we have a lot to learn from what you're looking at. This this particular moment we find ourselves in. And I wonder if you could speak to that contradictory tendency that on the one hand, the sort of aspirations for radical leftist politics that would motivate art praxis is still sort of hovering along the horizon. But on the other hand, it's coming continually under fire on the part of other discourses that claim to greater relevance in undoing forms of domination, and that locate revolution as just another cliche and another form of domination. I wonder if you could sort of speak to that.
Sure, thank you, Jaleh. Yeah, I think in these little bit later artists and also I de-emphasize, or I didn't zero in on the ones who are more related to what we can call decolonial practices, folks who are much more invested in Afro-Caribbean cosmologies and epistemologies. But sure, that is there. I think it's just a very complex thing because, what I find one of the crucial questions on Elso, who's a little bit, who I just showed one work with the bird just to jog everyone's memory, is that like the crux of the crux is he prefiguring a decolonial aesthetic, a decolonial epistemology, or were these or are these cosmologies and epistemologies simply in the objects and the cultures that he reached for? So it's maybe he was just really good before being decolonial at creating a capacious definition of the Americas. So I think the question is, that's the argument. Like there's no there's no neutral. There's no sitting on the fence of it. You either have to say yes, he was decolonial, he prefigured some of this, and this is what I'm going to argue for, or you say no, he just happened to touch on a series of references and cultures that already were pregnant with these epistemologies or beholden to them, and they transferred into his work by contact, right? Was it an injunction? Was it a decision? Was it an accident? And I think that's where we are. We have to kind of make these cases. And so what I think with someone like Elso or like Cuban artists who more deliberately kind of engage Afro-Caribbean and Amerindian cultures is that in real time, they lived this problem that we're kind of taking apart now. They lived it in real time. And I don't think they lived it dishonestly, right? This was their two realities and they were enmeshed. And, they went to school and got ideology in the day and they went home and, gave their offerings to Elegua or something. And it was organic. So I think in this way, aside from whatever else I said, in that way too, I think they're quite an interesting case study to do today. Because I think that's maybe what we have. I don't want to be categorical like that. These meshings are rare, let's say, in what we call the West. And so here we have, within the space of the West, the margins of the West, a moment in which those things may have been together. And maybe they could be useful for us to think through what we're trying to think through now. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers at all, but I hope it at least clarifies how I see the problem.
Yeah, no, thank you. That is tremendously clarifying. You're saying that due to the contingencies of that historical moment and that geopolitical context, that these questions came together fairly organically, even though if we were to abstract them from that geopolitical historical context, it might seem a slightly thornier proposition to try and make recent discourses around decolonial thinking gel with, you know, remnants of Marxian frameworks around revolution. So for your part, would you say that the kind of communist horizon that briefly enjoyed a kind of recrudescence of sorts, if you will, after the great crash of 2008 up through, you know, the moment of Occupy and the Oakland Commune and so on and so forth around 2011, do you think that these discourses are still, I'm not going to bring up whether they're relevant or not, that's just too much, but do you think that they are commensurable with forms of post-colonial thinking? I should say, you know, I'll put all my cards on the table and say, for my part, although I struggle with this a lot in the geopolitical context I find myself in now, I do think that a communist horizon and a form of anti-capitalist thinking is part and parcel of decolonial thinking, for my part. And that's how I would try and elaborate these discourses. But I also understand that for some who arrive at the hope of decolonization through the vector of identity politics, that, you know, remnants of anti-capitalist and communist thinking are often understood to be hostile. So I'm just curious about how you think we could extrapolate from your case study of this work to try and think about our present conjuncture, where there are pockets in the world that might need to think these things together.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that, so again, I'm going to be like running two tracks at once. I think that it is right that there's a decolonial school that sees the legacies of Marxism, or however you want to call them, as part of the problem. But then I also remember that decolonial discourse comes out of Frantz Fanon and, you know, Walter Rodney, and these were deeply Marxist thinkers too. So it's so it's I mean, on the one hand, I think that, and I think, you know, you think like the experiments in Bolivia, they were totally bound to a kind of Marxist thinking that, granted, it prioritized indigenous epistemologies and cosmologies and respected and kind of formed itself to them, but it was there. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, I want to say that. On the other hand, I'm not in a living community that is building decolonial thought from the ground up today. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, I want to remember history. On the other hand, I don't want to be like this imposing hand that says, as you build, you know, from the world you live in, a decolonial discourse, don't forget to put your Lukács in there, you know? Like, that's not, yeah. I mean, these are practices that are from the ground up. So I would say, though, that even for those practices, thinkers that come from that legacy are resources, right? I mean, they do have, and it's not, they also have not just an ideology, but they also have modes of analysis that are quite, I find, still quite useful. You know, in the seminar today, we were talking about the difference between a kind of straightforward American positivist essay and an Adornian essay that, you know, that it's not an unfolding of an idea, it's an unfolding of idea and then pitting it against its contradiction and seeing what that is. So I think there's still modes of or uses of tools of usage that I think are applicable or should be tested.
I wonder if I can just ask you both a question, because just to try and catch up on this conversation. And when we think about the condition of revolutions, we think of a change that is then in the world manifest, and it's irreversible, like it's changed everything, right? And so, Gean, when you talk about this process of rectification, which you could say is also kind of qualified by the revolutionary desire or the spirit of revolution, but is misdirected in the sense because it's contradictory, because it manifests as a neoconservative restitution of the same, as if we can go back in time. You know, this kind of, we've made the irreversible and now we can time travel back and recuperate certain conditions. But of course, those conditions, as you've already said, Gean, don't exist anymore. The context has changed. And so in this description of the artworks and the artists, and this is what I think Jaleh was like referring to, is that there's this kind of high level investment in negation, you know, like the kind of the rule of art becomes like a principle of negation almost, as one finds oneself in this dilemma. And in a sense that the index of the revolutionary spirit is kept alive in the spirit of negation. And I think, Jaleh, that's what you were making me think of. And you know, we might say, well, isn't that a contradiction and whatnot? But we could also say, well, it's following the logic. It's very logical in the sense that there is a principle of revolution there, but it's a revolution a revolutionary sensibility that tries to stay to the principle of the revolution rather than it's like revolution without qualities, let's say, something like that. And just to finish my point, that I think one of the things that risks in a way in the principle of negation is that it risks kind of producing its own crisis of crisis, its own malaise, its own, like it's like, well, let's stop making art and play baseball, and if we call baseball art, then we're ironists, you know. So it pushes one to the field of fiction as a kind of where fiction, or the idea of production of images, becomes like a site of not refusal or resistance, but a kind of fatigue, a kind of sadness and a giving up and exhaustion. So I don't really have a question, but I guess what's interesting to me is when, Jaleh, you talked about that, you know, the dominance and revolution not being popular things we want to talk about. I think one of the reasons is because, as you say, that after postmodernism, there might be the assumption that we just can't, not only are these things impossible and they don't exist, but if they were to exist, they'd be the worst case scenario for everyone. And yet they exist. they have existed and they do exist. And I think that there is some work in kind of disentangling these vectors, if you like, of power. And so it leads me to the question really is, if art has a spirit of negation, can it be a constructive negation, or will it find itself, do you guys think, in the kind of post-postmodern malaise, which is very much conducive to neoliberal capitalism, and goes back to that question of decolonial critique as well. So if anyone wants to talk about that, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I in the seminar today, I said that when I say like that a form kind of freezes its time, right, its kind of social preconditions are somehow indexed in the form. I went also and said that there's a vulgar way to use that methodology, and then there's a way to say, but you know, it not only freezes its preconditions, but it also freezes the possibilities to exit those preconditions that are available in them. So I think one of the things that I think I need to think through more is, well, I think that there's multiple, so there's a a frontal level in which this work that I showed addresses the institution and policy and the general tenor of the time. And I think there's a second tier at which, through a little bit more decoy practice, where they themselves become the infants that the revolution wants to imagine itself as, right? It wants to imagine itself as when it was young and had all this power and all this possibility. So they kind of infantilize themselves as a parody of that. But I think there's another tier, which I certainly didn't touch it and I haven't thought through enough, is what are the possibilities of so do they, in challenging the revolution, do these artists reopen its possibility and saying, well, this one is done, and we are and we recognize it as the last subjects of that process, and in doing so we now have an exit into another revolution. And it might not be that kind of revolution, it might even be into a space of decolonial thinking, for instance, but what are the possibilities that are coded, the possibilities of exit that are coded in the way these forms register their time or their social preconditions, or however you want to say it. So I think this is certainly something that I would want to think through some more. What are they saying? And I think it's also healthy to separate the agents they were at that moment versus who they've become in exile, and what did they crystallize as revolutionary subjects in that specific moment. And the question is, what did they waste, right? What did they were not able to activate?
And just one tiny point before Jaleh is that what you make me think of, Gean, when you're saying this is my question on constructive negation, a luxury in the conditions that we find ourselves, like in where we live, as opposed to being in the conditions, the very, the different constraints, both ideological and material, that are faced in other places. So that's what you're making me think of when you're responding to that as well. So thank you.
Yeah, I think the issue of constructive negation that Amanda brings up is really key in thinking about the issue of context. So that constructive negation has a degree of collective meaning in Cuba in the mid-1980s. So constructive negation is even worth being sent to prison for, right? Within that contextual envelope. Whereas, as Amanda points out, in a kind of capitalist, the way that capital totalizes, in the way that it's totalized an art world, constructive negation is expected of each and every artist to the point that it becomes affirmative and becomes part of a shared structure of cynicism, because it's not even being worth sent to prison for. And so that is a way in which artists have painted themselves into a corner, right? That there is this kind of historicity of a revolutionary avant-garde that is still demanding constructive negation. And yet the way that constructive negation lands in the international art fair world of the present is as purely affirmative nihilism. So I think it's what you're giving us is very useful in reminding us of the specificity of a context in giving constructive negation some kind of collective traction that it's even worth being sent to prison for. So I'm happy for that reminder, even though it the flip side of that is I'm reminded once again how difficult it is to mobilize any kind of meaningful negation at right now in our present moment. On the other hand, though, I just don't see how forms of post-colonial or decolonial thinking are going to move forward without addressing capital as the ultimate colonial form. So that's the other side to this whole thing. So I'm grateful for you, to your discussion of that particular context in showing us the ropes. Some of the questions we might have to revive in the present and in other geopolitical sites if anything, if culture is going to move forward in any historically meaningful way.
Well, in that sense, can I ask you both what you think about, we talked about negation, and we talked about this idea that art sees itself in some ways through critical trajectories as producing this dynamic towards the impossible or the open. And sorry, someone's trying to do a spam call on me in this call, so I'm just getting rid of them. So yeah, we talked about this idea of negation, this idea that the artwork can avoid the programmatic instrumentalizing or the causal narratives of the rectification process and its conservative kind of political conditions through calling upon the open. But we've also just said that by calling upon open possibilities, art can fall back into the cynicism of semantic nihilism or affirmative nihilism, as you were just saying, Jaleh. So it's almost like art's caught between the rock and the hard place of, it doesn't want to see itself as doing its own rectification process, because that smacks of totalizing dominance and power, imperialism and inequality. And on the other hand, if it claims the open, it falls back into the always already kind of powers of neoliberal capital, like affirmation of banalities of difference and fetishized commodities relations. So I wonder if the art needs to have some conservatism in a way. And I don't mean that, I just mean that, does art need to conserve anything in the conditions of the life? I mean, does it need norms? Does it need structures? Does it need to use things that exist in the world? Does it need to think about the things that are empirically given to it, that aren't, that might not be the kind of imperialist force of the conservative, nor might be the neoliberal capitalist problem? So, I don't know the answer to this. I'm just genuinely wondering, like, is there something that art needs to think about in terms of constraints, conservation, structures and norms here, rather than freedom as being free from? I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And it often occurs to me that is the last use value, if you will, of art's reference to its local conditions, that what localism continues to do, other than, being its own kind of fetish or its own kind of strange claim to authenticity. I think the reason that artists and practitioners continue to cling to the lure of the local is that it offers some, what you're calling a norm or a reference or some kind of anchoring device to think through all of the problematic, fetishistic, nihilistic qualities of global art production. But that's just my sense of why localism continues to be so attractive to art world denizens. I think my larger position on this is that you're absolutely right. Art practice is caught between a rock and a hard place at this time. And I don't really know what it's going to take to move that. I think identity politics is itself quite conservative, but is doing what you're suggesting, is offering some kind of normative basis to offer us criteria for whether something is progressive or critical or reactionary. And that's why people love it right now. But Gean?
No, I was thinking, yeah. So I think, no, identity politics is tough because, well, it does what you said. You say it also scrambles some of those things, and the value projected on the identity sometimes excuses the work, the ground it sits on from being judged properly, right? I'm just thinking of the immense amount of figurative painting that now is bound to identity politics. And while I understand many things about it, I also don't understand many things about it. And one of them is that it has been a return to very conservative forms, not in the way you mean it, Amanda, but in the other way. And it has reinforced. So I think market transactions never went away, but there was a little bit of a shame to them for some time. You did it, but that wasn't what you talked about. And now it seems like market transactions are the coolest thing in the world again. So it's identity works are difficult in that way, I think. They're an alibi for well, they do much. They're also an alibi for things that we thought we'd surpass to come back.
Exactly that. But the fact that the three of us can even arrive at that is, music to my ears. It's, I think, very productive that we can even go over that problem and be here now thinking about it. We're in a very strange moment where it's either identity politics or NFTs. And that's the sort of governing dialectic of the present. And there's very little space to maneuver around those positions. But again, I'm grateful for your talk today, because it's a reminder of other very difficult moments in history where other impasses seem just as impossible, and yet. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I've, in talking about, when you talk about identity politics or NFTs, it's like, it's like culture does want the solace of the ground. And the only retreat it can find that self in is this reinvention of the sovereign self, which is ironically often claimed to be constructed in a materialist sense, but still claimed nevertheless as some self. So there's a lot of contradictions in that. And I also think that, the kind of high frequency modality, the delirium of the NFT world, it's a really great kind of polemic in a way to look at how both of these conditions are entangled. But I think, when Gean's talk, what it made me think of is how it is possible to kind of do some disentangling of the structures that are entangled together in this complex of the problem. And that being, as we said, material conditions, ideologies, histories, and people's actions as well that you've talked about. So we are at the end of our time, but I just want to say that a big thank you to the audience for being out there and listening. This will be archived on our channel, so people can come back and watch it again and share. And I want to say a final thank you to Jaleh for being a great respondent today. Thank you so much. I want to say thank you to Gean for doing the whole paper and the seminar with our students that was before that. So I just want to say thank you.